There we go. Apologies. Please do forgive me. Okay. I have my refreshments refreshed. A little bit of gamer subs. Got some Bowberry going on here. And, I have so many freaking flavors. I actually ran out of pyro powder. I need to get more of that. Anyway, so we're going to watch a quick short video about drones from Lazerpig, and we will discuss it from there. Okay, Pig, start talking. Again, a short video. If you look down at the timer, it's almost 30 damn minutes. That's short for the frickin' pig. He'll talk about tanks for hours.
Hello, I'm Lazerpig. Recently, my inbox has been inundated with links to this article. Britain's Challenger 3 might already be outdated. This is brought to us by Military Watch magazine, an opinion blog with questionable origins masquerading as a news source that once proudly stated that Ukraine had lost 27 of its donated M1A1 Abrams tanks at the Battle of Avdiivka and surrounding areas back in 2023.
Yeah, I already doubt that.
On Russian propaganda numbers.
Oh
it is
my
now
God.
almost 2026. And the number of lost M1 Abrams tanks confirmed at the time of recording stands at 22, 3 of which have been returned to service. The article is a
the majority of those are probably due to maintenance issues because
Defense
Ukrainians don't know how to
Journal,
fix
nuance,
shit.
with references added in about how Russian and Chinese tanks were just, oh, so much better designed, and then given a snappy clickbait title. The objective here should be obvious to anyone, but propaganda works because you want it to be true.
And
remember,
you're stupid.
only boomers read the headlines and believe them, not you, because obviously you're a smart boy and you read the article, didn't you? Today I want to address the original article in the UK Defense Journal, which, though posted by its chief founder and editor, George Allison, is actually the work of one Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, the chief creative officer of his own
God,
opinion.
look at that hair.
Crawford is a former tanker with the four...
Stop. That deserves a replay.
Crawford, the chief creative officer of his own opinion. Crawford is a former tanker with the 4th Royal Tank Regiment who left the army in 1999 and has even written a book about it. I like Crawford. I've read his book. But unfortunately, he has become the latest victim to something I call HDDS, or Herder Drone Syndrome.
Herder Drone Syndrome.
Herder drone syndrome is the problem faced by professional military opinionists who have a surface-level knowledge on drone warfare, but none of the actual deep understanding on how that warfare has rapidly developed over the past few years to understand how drones may affect things in a future war, or even how it's affecting things currently in Ukraine. Symptoms of HDDS include flashy clickbait titles that proclaim any new technology from tanks to jets is doomed because why spend billions of dollars on a weapon system if a $20 drone can take it out. It makes casual references to the ever-increasing loss of Western tanks on the Ukrainian front, makes grandiose gestures that inflate the actual capability of small FPV drones, and surreptitiously, usually just by not knowing any better, parrot Russian propaganda that all Western tanks are too big and too heavy. It ignores the actual opinions of Ukrainian tank crews and fails to take into account that of the 95 Western tanks that have been lost on the Ukrainian front, very few of those were actually taken out by drones, and of that 95, 73 were highly outdated models that have either since been replaced or are in the process of being replaced. Out of those 73, 71 were models built before 1990, and 21 of those were tanks designed in the 1960s. The actual lessons here is that supplying Ukraine with outdated tanks, limited training, and none of the regular support elements typically enjoyed by other Western nations that are often seen as mandatory to keep those tanks in the fight has meant that their effectiveness has been limited.
Support elements are key. If you don't have proper maintenance and support, such as supply maintenance and sustainment, you're not going to get anywhere. This is something I've said multiple times about the Ukrainian war. The reason the Ukrainians are having trouble beating the Russians, and the reason the Russians are having trouble beating the Ukrainians, is that they use the same fucking logistics system. You can have a million different ways of tactical brilliance and everything else. If you use the same fucking logistics system, you are fighting a rock against a rock. You're not going to move. The reason America beats the freaking britches off of everybody because we have a better logistics system than anybody else out there. Our logistics is what wins us wars. Yes, we have the fancy tanks and the high 5-jet aircraft, but none of that shit works without an efficient logistics system. Want proof? World War II, German Tiger tank. Objectively, by firepower, armor, and sheer technical prowess, it was the best tank. It couldn't do shit, though, because the Germans couldn't keep it up and running. Most of that shit broke down because of maintenance. Why? Because they couldn't get them the parts, they couldn't get the resources, and they couldn't get the shit to them. Same thing. Germans technically had better tactics and resources in North Africa. They had more supplies to use than they could deal with. The Italians were filling their ports to the point of overfill. Why didn't they have enough to beat the British at Alexandria then? Because they didn't have a deep water port. They had a supply chain that stretched over half of North Africa. If you don't have good logistics, you can't win a fucking war.
Ukraine's insight into how these tanks operate in battle conditions are of incredible value, but it does not strike a parallel with what would happen if Germany, Britain, Sweden, or America went to war with Russia. And keep in mind, even
because
under
our
the
logistics
less than
are
ideal
different.
Conditions Ukraine fights in, with the
Ukraine is train-based. We are truck-based. There's a difference.
At the time of recording, for every one Western tank they have lost, 43.7 Russian tanks have been destroyed. The second part of HDDS is completely
our tanks are better.
Capability
Fuck the
and
Russian
cost
tanks.
of the drones. There are a lot of drones on the Ukrainian front with a lot of different
Fucking many.
capabilities, none of which cost $20. The drones you buy in your local hobby store cannot simply be fitted with a bomb and driven into a tank. The $20 drones from AliExpress that everyone points to have limited flight range, limited battery life, and most
limited lift
importantly,
capacity.
limited payload. You can't just throw a kilogram of explosive onto something that can barely lift its own battery weight. They can also be jammed quite easily, or traced and folded back to the operator without
taken
the
over.
operator even being aware that that's happening, due to the litany of safety software that these things have due to government regulations. This was something the Ukrainians learned very quickly when they tried this tactic back in 2014, and then again in 2022, when the Russians either jammed those drones, took control of them, or sent one flying back towards the operator, or just showed up with a full assault team and blew them the fuck away. Drones need to be heavily modified before they can be used effectively on the battlefield. Images you've seen of them dropping grenades into the open hatches of vehicles are, for the better part, propaganda. Tanks don't sit around not moving on a battlefield with their hatches open unless they've already been disabled and or abandoned, or are not expecting to be in combat. The simplest of drones currently on the Ukrainian front cost in excess of $400 to make each, and that is with volunteers, 3D printers, and importing the cheapest made parts from Temu. And these factories don't run at a profit. They absorb the full cost through donations, not selling the drones to the military. Things you can get away with in the kind of war Ukraine is fighting, but not something that can be easily replicated in a World War III situation. China might have some opinions if we start trying to buy drone parts from them if we went to war with, say for example, China. An entire industry would therefore need to be replicated, with drone factories producing their own parts, and that comes at significant cost.
We could do that.
A vast number of drone factories were set up in the hopes of cashing in on the drone military craze, and most of them have failed to expand beyond a single office, 3D printers, small teams of eager 20-somethings, and a dream, simply because, well, firstly, the actual cost of setting up mass production.
Before he explains, it's a multitude of reasons, including they don't know what the fuck they're doing. If you have no military experience and you try to get in on military tactics like this and try to take things over to say, look what I'm doing, I know how to manage stuff. If you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to get anywhere. This is why usually you need to leave these to actual people who know what to do when it comes to war. Most of these guys don't know what they're doing. They're just trying to make tech.
Production is far greater than first anticipated, especially when one realizes that it's not just drone parts they need, but camera equipment, night vision, thermals, long-range battery packs, and radio equipment capable of resisting interference, triangulation, and interception, most of which is beyond the capability of these companies. Potentially, you could knock the price of production down quite significantly if you got all that set up, and you ignore the cost of paying people who have to put it all together, who are not going to work for free. Trust me, it's very tedious and monotonous work. And then the realization realization that in fact you're a company, and at some point you're going to have to make a
profit.
All of this is how a $400 drone becomes a $10,000 drone. Even then, those $400 drones carry about enough munitions to kill a person or knock out light vehicles or generally unarmored targets. They did this to one of the trucks I was raising money for last year. That truck was fucked, but everyone inside walked away with their lives. Tanks are traditionally quite a bit more armored than a truck, and generally tend
That
to
shit would
survive hits
bounce
little
off a
bit better.
tank.
I mentioned Ukrainian tank crews earlier. In some of these interviews, they have talked about how tanks generally survive multiple hits from drones because the Russians don't always have access to the heavier munitions required to take them out. Those are considerably more expensive, harder to produce, and considerably more rare, allowing those tanks to race into drone hotspots, take out their target, and withdraw before those munitions arrive. A good example of one of those munitions is the famous Russian Lancet. In a full-time war economy, one of these costs around $20,000 to manufacture, or to put that in perspective, the cost of 5 artillery shells. This is of course assuming Russia is telling the truth when it gives these numbers up and aren't just
Which they most
calculating
likely
the cost
are
of
lying.
materials and not including labor, setup, or the cost of the launcher. The thing about the
That looks
Lancet
phallic.
is it's a drone in name only. It's or the cost
Don't look
of
at
the
me. Look at that and tell me. Look at that and tell me that doesn't look like a dick. It's not me.
launcher. The thing about the Lancet is it's a drone in name only. It's technically a loitering munition which have been around for quite some time. Every country has been developing them for the past 10 years and some of those were given to Ukraine. In China,
Oh my god. Okay, I had my fun.
produced a tank which fires
Their freaking bullshit looks like something out of a literal like toy store. This doesn't look like a damn tank. It looks like it looks like something I played with when I was 5. I hate these shits.
them, much to the delight of this article's author. This is not unusual. Future developments of both the Leopard and the Challenger series will have loitering munition capability, and it was a prime feature of the KF-51 Panther. The Switchblade, currently in use by both the US and the Ukrainian army, costs around $60,000 per unit, with the more dedicated anti-tank version costing somewhere in the region of $100,000 per unit.
Hi, mid-production and quite drunk Lazerpig here. So I'm editing
As
this
usual.
next part out because I kind of went off on this bizarre long tangent about the technical differences between the Switchblade and the Lancet because for some reason we still live in a world where people who comment on the defense industry still do not understand that there might be a difference in quality between a $20,000 drone built cheaply out of off-the-shelf parts mostly imported from China and a $60,000 drone built by a company that used to build unmanned spy planes for the CIA back in the 1980s.
The NASA Pathfinder project, autonomous solar-powered aircraft that could fly without having to refuel, started life back in the 80s as a Black Op. Build a fly forever drone aircraft that could shoot down incoming nukes. It was canned by Bill Clinton, classified in 93. The history of the project is wild. I can only fucking imagine.
But then I need to remember that's the logic of people who know throwing a grenade at a tank won't work, but think if you attach that grenade to a drone, it magically becomes an anti-tank missile.
Who the fuck thinks
my
that?
fan base is a mite more intelligent than that.
Just a
Or
bit,
at
my
least
friend.
I like to think so. So outside of the technical specifications, what the Switchblade can do over the Lancet in terms of self-scouting, camera quality, stealthiness, general
Oh, shit.
precision versus moving targets, is irrelevant in the current context of trying to prove that cheap drones have made tanks obsolete, which is presumably what this video was at one point about when I sat down to write it and is now, well, it's this. What you need to know is the Switchblade can be carried by one soldier in a backpack, thrown on the ground
Ooh.
and then fired like a mortar within seconds. It's got infrared as standard.
I didn't know it was that
a whole
small,
bunch of
damn.
really clever things like
This is pretty much the next Javelin.
guide other Switchblades onto targets or coordinate with other drones and have multiple Switchblades hit multiple different targets simultaneously, to lower
Excuse me,
the
had to
chances of
sneeze.
your enemy going, oh no, a drone, and then doing something really wild like taking cover. The Lancet does none of that. It's basically just a TV missile on a catapult. I mean,
It's the
still an
dick
effective
missile.
weapon, and we'll get onto that. But the reason Ukraine is able to get in with the tanks, do the job, and then get out before those things show up is because the Lancet is a very clumsy weapon. It requires a truck to move it around, it's quite large, it's quite heavy, it needs 2 people to set it up, and all of that takes time. And you are vulnerable that entire time you're doing this.
Yep.
You're vulnerable to drones spotting you, you're vulnerable to artillery, and you're just tempting the high Mars of fate. And there is some evidence that Ukrainian troops have been deliberately spooking the Russians by showing up with Western tanks in order to attract those weapons into an area that they're watching in
Looks like
order
powdered
to
sugar.
kill the operators while they're trying to set these weapons up. To
Which
try
is
and
smart.
alleviate this, Russia has developed these good-to-go multi-launch systems. But again, that needs fixing onto a vehicle, and then you're just adding more complexity to the cost. And I think
And
this,
cost
among many other
to the
things,
cost.
is a good example of the constantly spiraling costs of running a weapons project like this. Any weapon system you
There's
develop,
always
regardless of how
countermeasures,
cheaply,
always,
is going to be
and you
up against a
always have to
constant
spend more
war
money.
between offense and defense. Your cheap weapon
Always.
is going to be super effective at first when no one is expecting it and
Mm-hmm.
have no ways to defend against it. That as they develop new systems or
Then it has to
techniques or
get more
tactics
proper.
against this cheap weapon, then that system is going to gradually become less effective over time and therefore must evolve to remain potent. The Lancet has gone through multiple versions, each time trying to increase its lethality or counter the defenses Ukraine has developed specifically against it, and I'll go on to some of those later. But needless to say, that means the Lancet, though it is estimated at costing roughly $20,000 to manufacture via various Russian reports, it was offered at export at $32,000 back when it was only seeing use in Syria, and now it's no longer offered for export, and that $20,000 number has never been updated as the weapon has grown in
Probably closer to
complexity.
40 to 50.
Hi. Slightly more sober mid production Lazerpig.
Jesus,
A slight
Lazerpig.
correction on the cost. I'm going to keep referring to the Lancet as a $20,000 drone because to change that I'd have to re-record the entire video, and this is meant to be a short, quick video, and I'm not re-recording the whole fucking thing. But the reality is we don't know how much it actually costs. The only source for the Lancet's cost is a Reuters article, which is quoting what
Flashbang.
I think
Oh,
is
God.
the original export cost
3
of
million
about
rubles.
3 million rubles, which is
God, their economy is
$37,000
jacked.
at the time of recording based on current exchange rates. The only claim for it ever being
Their
$20,000
freaking economy is
the Wikipedia
destroyed.
article,
Damn.
and that information was added on an account which has now been banned from Wikipedia. As far as I'm
Ooh.
aware, it's just never been noticed and corrected. Meaning it has more than likely now matched the Switchblade in terms of cost. You see this again with those cheap $400 drones. A year ago they cost $300 each.
Now they're
But every
400, now
iteration,
they're
they need to
500,
fly
now they're
faster, carry
600.
bigger payloads, be more durable. So this is kind of my whole shtick against the whole cheap drone argument. Arrows will still kill you, and they are much cheaper than bullets. But their effectiveness on the battlefield might be limited by certain other factors. Rant over, video continue.
Now, sure, even at the higher end of that, 100k
Look at all
is
that
a
carbon
far cry
fiber.
away from the millions it would cost to produce one tank. But the reality is we don't actually know how effective or
Excuse me for the
ineffective
sniffles.
the Lancet has been against tanks. Statistics for the Lancet come primarily from the website lostarmor.info, a Russian website set up to discredit Oryx, which exclusively documents Ukrainian losses and has been accused of labeling Russian losses as Ukrainian ones. In fairness, this might not be the website owner's fault. They did start documenting Russian losses, but were slapped down by the Russian courts for doing so. And they do try to provide sources for each claim, but if you check for sources on its claim numbers, it simply directs you to an endless unorganized page of comments where random users submit footage gathered from Telegram channels, including Russian propaganda ones. Unlike Oryx, there is no verification or way to independently verify each claim outside of wading through hundreds of hours of comments, allowing falsehoods to hide among the noise, made even harder by the sheer amount of decoys Ukraine has has deployed, and the almost impossibility to tell most of those decoys from the real thing through the grainy images we are presented. This is problematic because, well, Russia has been hyping up the prowess of the Lancet to the extreme. In 2023, a Challenger 2 hit a mine and was abandoned and destroyed by its crew after persistent artillery fire forced them to abandon the recovery process. Russia insisted numerous times it was actually a Lancet that hit the tank, and according to the Ukrainians, the Russians fired numerous Lancets at the tank even after it was a burning hulk. Alright, I've just eaten a sandwich that had way too much cheese in it, so let's get this out of the way. Originally, they were claiming it was the corner
witness me.
which is far more believable until, the Lancet starts to become the propaganda darling, and suddenly it's responsible for everything. There's actually a small rumor. I'm going to address it here. This is the second Challenger 2 that gets taken out, which was apparently blown up by a Lancet, and this is what happened to it. But in the same area, a Lancet hits a T-64 and does this. See, the actual capability of the Lancet is really widely varied, and it's kind of led to this rumor that because there isn't really...
Well, that's true for any ammunition when it comes to tanks. Like, depending on how you hit it, where you hit it, when you hit it, the freaking mood of the sky, the shift of the moisture in the air can really... Like, there's 1,000,001 factors that can really fuck with how when ammunition hits something. Like, you should check this out in World War II. Like, you may hit a tank square on thinking it's going to kill it, and at just the perfect moment, that tank dips down into a little divot. It changes the angle. It impacts. Ricochet. Like, that's impossible. This should have ripped through the armor. And then next minute, you're thinking, you know what? I'm not gonna kill it, but I'm firing anyway. And it fires, and there's just a little bit of extra cold on that one point, and it has like a small fracture in it from just too much heat on it. That pow broke right through. Why? Because they just didn't manufacture it properly that one time. There's 1,000,001 different factors that can fuck with it. Those 1,000,001 factors usually don't come into play, but when they do, oh my god, is it a moment.
Different variants with different payloads like there is with the Switchblade, that the Russians are flying around regular drones disguised as Lancets to make it look like the weapon is far more numerous than it actually is. But that's just a rumor, But while there's a picture of the Challenger,
that's just a theory.
Nothing upsets the Vatniks more than pictures of British tanks. I've got no idea why. Let me put a random one on the screen. Boom, there we go. At the time of recording, 2 Challenger 2s have been lost. But Wikipedia claims, according to the Tanks of Ukraine Army page, that 4 have been lost. Now, normally, I wouldn't bring this up, but a lot of people keep messaging me.
They got
saying,
different citations.
4 Challengers have been lost. What do you think of that, pig? This is the voice that I use for all the haters that message me on Discord and crap. That's what you sound like in
Why do people
head,
bother him on Discord? I don't understand this.
Just can't be bothered.
I don't agree with him on everything, but dear God, I don't
Anyway,
pester the
this is the only
bitch.
source that I could find for that number. So, could you all just go ahead and just check the sources for that number?
55,
please?
87, 88, and 89.
Because
Why are they so
two of them
different
are
apart?
The same footage reported on different websites, and the third isn't even a picture of a Challenger 2. You do know I actually check this shit, right? I don't just believe.
God bless
you
him
when
for
you
that.
say this shit. But hey ho, apparently I'm the one that doesn't check their sources. I could just edit this myself and correct it, but Wikipedia editors get really, really uppity whenever a YouTuber wanders in, so I find it's easier just to whine about it in a video, because they'll fix it. They always do.
You'll get more attention anyway.
Back to what I was saying. The footage of the supposed Lancet attack that took it out has never been publicly released. This
Probably
makes
never going
judging
to
the
be.
actual effectiveness of the Lancet quite difficult and prone to very dramatic arguments. The likelihood is the Lancet is probably a fairly effective weapon, but likely not for the reason you think. When it comes to precision munitions, Russian troops have very few options readily available, and as a result, a Lancet has been used in a variety of roles to fill the gaps, taking the place of artillery and counter-battery, as well as more traditional support elements, as combat losses sustained in Ukraine have severely diminished the Russian army's ability to rely on its support elements, in particular artillery and aircraft. In the later stages of 2022, in response to Ukraine's increased counter-battery effectiveness, effectiveness, the Russians began pulling hordes of towed artillery out of storage, some of which dated as far back as the Second World War. Yet, with the limited ability to retain these units in service,
what the hell were they thinking about fighting when they had this shit?
After they had been fired through the loss of transport vehicles, Russia's artillery dominance has finally began to wane, and as a result, systems like the Lancet have been forced into this role. The irony here being that a $20,000 drone system is now doing the work of an artillery shell, which the Russians once bragged they could make for under $1,500. At no point has the author questioned that the reason drones are so numerous in Ukraine is that both sides are potentially lacking the equipment that would have traditionally performed that job and are falling back onto cheaply made drones to fill the gap. Or that perhaps it's other things that are being outdated. This, of course, all bleeds into HDDS's third part. The third part of HDDS is, of course, quite simply forgetting all the work done into anti-drone technology over the past few years. For any argument about how drones have suddenly made everything obsolete, you have to firstly just ignore any developments into anti-drone warfare that have also taken place. You have to ignore that in spite of the existence of heavy drone-based munitions that can take out tanks, Ukraine still uses tanks. Quite a lot. And there are reasons for this, and I mentioned one of those reasons earlier. Lancets, regardless of how effective they actually are, can be countered quite easily. At their heart, they are basically just self-propelled TV missiles, and they are susceptible to the same jamming
to hacking and jamming.
Drones. They can be intercepted by FPV drones quite
taken
easily.
Over, manipulated.
Ukraine has developed a cottage industry of FPV drones specifically designed to take down Lancets. Where these drones are not
drones to counter
Ukraine
drones.
has found the best solution to fight against Lancets and Shaheeds from bombing cities is an old World War II propeller plane with a machine gun on the back. Hi, me again. Okay, so it's not actually a World War II plane, it's a Yak-52. It's an old Soviet acrobatic plane built in Romania during the 1970s. But I mean, just look at the damn thing. I mean, come on! But they have found that the most
How is that up there? Where the fuck is that Russian Air Force? How are they not shooting these things down?
Which Russia threw up in a
what the fuck are you on to, Russia? Where is your freaking power? This is just and before anybody says like I'm not on Russia's side. They're fucking assholes. But like, you are talking about how you have your Su-52, what 70th, whatever that shit is you think's up here to the freaking F-22. You cannot do shit with that, and you have these propeller planes flying around in the air? You're a freaking joke. You're a joke. Where's your air dominance, bitch?
Have proven to be quite effective. Russia was forced to introduce a newer, more updated version of the Lancet, which contained additional sensors and tandem warheads,
which is more expensive.
It has never been publicly revealed, and its effectiveness remains mired in the questionable logic of propaganda.
Oh boy.
However, what has been revealed is Ukraine has the ability to track these new units of Lancets quite easily. Because jamming equipment is now so prevalent, it requires forces on both sides operating drones to cycle through frequencies trying to find one that isn't jammed. I'll get onto that.
Which they do with radios all the time anyway.
Another thing sufferers of HDDS are ignoring. In the first days Lancets were being used en masse, the Russians would be forced to stop jamming the frequency that the Lancet was being used in. The Ukrainians would simply cycle through frequencies, find the one that wasn't being jammed, and then jam it themselves, causing the Lancets to just fall out of the sky. In a response, the Russians are now forced to turn off their jamming systems when firing a Lancet to prevent the Ukrainians from figuring out the frequency. This not only makes them exceedingly vulnerable to Ukrainian return fire, it also pre-warns the Ukrainians that Lancets are on the way when all Russian jamming equipment suddenly turns off. Equipment which does exist to prevent things like this, which every
So they kind of had that same problem in World War I, is that the British would fire a heavy amount of barrage for sometimes even a week of just constant artillery fire. Boom, 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 boom. Send it down the way, hitting the Germans and everything. Then they'd stop. Immediately, the Germans would rush out, man the machine guns. Why? Because they knew the whistles were coming and they knew the British were about to charge across no man's land. It was like clockwork. You now know why that fucking war never really changed. People moved inches because they kind of telegraphed what they were going to do.
Tech Bro knows about and is probably screaming at the screen in defiance over is expensive. And therefore, not something you find on a $400 drone, or a weapon that's designed to be cheap like the Lancet or the Shaheed. Jammers are, of course, not as sophisticated as you might think. At the end of the day,
They're still
are
working.
just things that scream very loudly in a certain frequency, blocking that frequency from being used by anything else nearby. They require a lot of power and can typically only scream in one frequency, or at best a narrow band of similar frequencies, hence why so many of them have multiple aerials. Russia's cope sheds, for again all the hilarity their appearance made, are covered in these jamming stations, allowing these mobile bunker things that Russia proudly calls the Beast to block drones at a wide radius over a long range of frequencies. The idea behind them that these so-called Beasts move ahead of the assault, blocking drones for the advancing units behind. The
I swear it's like World War I all over again.
Questionable. Now, you might think the best defense against this is to simply have the drone change frequencies, and you'd be right, but changing frequencies isn't as easy as pressing a button or changing a dial. In fact, in many cases, the aerial assembly has to be completely ripped off and replaced with one with a newer frequency, hence why a lot of drones, such as the ones I helped build with Richard, are shipped without an aerial, allowing the receiving unit to add their own as needed. This is another drawback of the cheap drone assembly, as modular frequency modules, or even the ability to change frequency on the fly as needed, sometimes the drone automatically picking one that is not actively being jammed, is quite expensive, and another reason why things like the Switchblade are more expensive than the Lancet. But that's the old idiom. You get what you pay for. Putting soldiers' lives at risk with cheaper equipment that might not always work is the lesson the US military has learned the hard way. Ask any US veteran and they will happily bitch to you about any number of equipment problems based entirely on that topic, often for several hours, without ever stopping for breath. It's quite impressive. The real counter to the jamming problem for both sides has been to simply not use frequencies at all. Large spools of fiber optic cabling is now attached to drones, which makes them immune to jamming systems, or the operator being so easily triangulated, with the added benefit that the latency is always perfect, allowing the operator to see in high definition without having to risk a higher latency connection.
But there's always countermeasures
of hell for both sides, to the point where parts of the front lines are littered in webs of fiber optic. So far, Ukraine's best defense against them has been barbed wire, sometimes attached to a motor, which causes it to spin, entangling the fiber optic cabling of those drones passing overhead and causing it to snap. However, the best defense against those drones simply remains.
And that wasn't barbed wire, that was C-wire.
On the front lines of both sides,
Jesus Christ,
are now covered in large arc structures, a cope cage supreme, if you will, that
frickin'
prevent
World
drones
War I
attacking convoys and supply trucks, and both sides will typically spend days or often weeks trying to find holes or discreetly make holes in these nets, and then have several drones lie in wait across the road, ambushing any vehicles they find. This has led to Ukraine up-armoring everything from medevac to supply trucks in order to minimize the damage caused by these ambush drones. In much the same way, US and British forces in Iraq were forced to up-armor their patrol vehicles owing to the threat of IEDs. Of course, Ukraine constantly stating that you need to up-armor everything to make it harder for drones to take you out is of course ignored by sufferers of HDDS, because if they acknowledge that, then how does making tanks lighter, faster and less armored make any sense? But if you're trying to push the Russian propaganda narrative that Western tanks are too big and too heavy, then this is a part of reality that you have to ignore. Of course, Ukraine's best counter to drones remains, and has surprisingly remained, old radar-guided anti-air systems from the Cold War. Because of the way they are designed, drones have
It's like skeet shooting. You think any of these shits are going to stand against any of those weapons? No. Those anti-air weapons are going to shred them. It's like shooting a freaking paper target with a 50 cal. It's going to be gone. That shit was designed to take out actual full aircraft with armor. That shit ain't gonna stand up a chance.
Relatively high radar cross-section for their size. Modern-day stealth fighters, despite being hundreds of times bigger, actually have smaller radar cross-sections than modern-day drones, meaning they can be easily picked up by radar systems. Mobile anti-air systems like the Gepard have proven exceedingly effective at taking them down, meaning to avoid systems like this, drones have to fly low to the ground, which makes finding targets considerably considerably harder. And when you're operating wild weasel attacks with drones, you have limited battery life to play with, and by the time you've gotten to a target area, you're more than likely to just take the first target of opportunity you see, as opposed to try and hunt for the bigger fish and risk your battery going flat, which means the guy standing out in the open gets the $400 drone to the face, but the tank camouflaged in the forest next to him gets a free pass. This is of course just on the Ukrainian front, where funds are limited and results are needed immediately. In countries not affected by this war, which includes every country in the world outside of Russia and Ukraine, funding and time for testing is in ample supply. Electronic warfare systems have proven quite effective against things like drone swarms, but EW systems are expensive and hard to explain, so let's skip all that and talk about lasers.
Oop.
There are people who propose.
Oh yeah, I remember. Oh, I've heard of this.
It's not really a good way to take out, let's say, 100 drones that are attacking you from all different directions.
Every country in the world now seems to be building lasers, and it's easy to see why. Lasers have been a thing for generations, but up until now, we've just never really had a use for them that wasn't more practical than the thing we were already doing. Now we do. For mere pennies a shot, a laser can hit a drone with, well,
laser precision
accuracy and take it down. These systems are not as expensive to build as you might think and cost pennies per shot. Rumors are that some of these systems have seen testing in Ukraine. Where these systems fit into our current doctrine is still being written, and where these things are now technologically will be considerably different in a few years' time. Ultimately, these weapons will need mounting onto something, and why can't that something be a tank? Laser tanks are finally here. The ultimate irony here is that a 2-penny laser is shooting down a $20,000 drone, which is doing the job of a $1,500 artillery shell. And this is being described by people who write for prestigious military news blogs as a cost-saving initiative because drone. This gets picked up by WebSlop and then posted to the website, subreddit, or Discord that you get your news from as a gotcha moment by people who have only read the title. But the nuance behind the emerging front of drone warfare
looks like drones are going to be a fad.
More complicated than these idiots like to proclaim. But as history has shown, every technological advancement ever made, from handheld launchers to aircraft to missiles to smart bombs, has all been heralded by these same idiots as the death of the tank. Tanks, of course, are still here and have simply adapted to change as needed. And as has become my catchphrase, it is not the biggest army that wins, it is the one that is the most adaptable to change.
True. And from what I can see, it looks like a radar-equipped tank with a high-power laser is the answer when it comes to these little drones. Hell, just putting radar in there and putting a 50 cal on it would work too.
My name's Lazerpig. Get the fuck out of my house.
Hey, you invited me in. Oh my god. You gotta love him. Yeah, gotta love him.